I'm Dr. Nick Gordon. My background is as both a historian and as an artist, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here talking to you today about one of Italy's most fantastic art movements, something that really kind of comes almost out of nowhere in Italy and is ultimately only very, very short-lived and ends up with some quite complex issues in the 1920s facing it. But it was, as we'll see, a revolutionary movement when it first appeared. Very, very forward-thinking and with ultimately a very long effect on modern art, not just in Italy, but also in Russia, Germany, France, and the UK as well. So it's one of the first modern, or Italy's first genuinely modern art movement, but it's also an art movement that would put Italy back on an international stage again as a mover and shaker in what was then contemporary art. Yeah, well, I think we still have a couple more people come through, but I don't want to hold you up with your time this morning with what you'll be doing elsewhere, so I might make a start. I'll just share my screen and we'll get going. Okay, so this morning we're looking at Italian Futurism and the fight at La Fenice, a fight that started in 1910 during the intermission of a performance at La Fenice. Oh, and just before I go much further, just to remind you, if you're coming in through Zoom webinar, next to where my face is appearing on the right-hand side of the screen, if you're finding that my face is too small, no, I'm not saying you should enlarge my face to take up the entire screen, but if you wanted to be able to see, if you're finding it too small, there are two lines next to that image and you can click on those and drag those across to the left, and that will expand the size of my face at the expense of the slides. So you can change that around to make it good for whatever suits you best. Okay. So also, just to let you know, if you have any follow-up questions or you'd like to get in touch about any aspect of this, my email is nick@theshortcourse.org, and you can get in touch with me. I usually answer that email quite frequently and quite regularly. Okay, so Futurism, when it starts in Italy, is an odd sort of movement because we have the main characters, the main artists and poets who are driving it forward, announcing the movement before they're even beginning to really produce any of the great art and literature that comes out of it. So what we're starting off with today is with some of these announcements that they were making, the sorts of things that they were saying and doing kind of when they were still conceptualizing the art that they were trying to create. So what I'm showing you here, for example, is, I've lost my share for a moment, I'll just reshare that. Is a kind of a photo of the key mover, the prime mover of the Futurist movement, which is this man here in the center, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti. We'll talk a little bit about more of him in a moment. It's a photo here that was taken of them outside of La Fenice prior to what would happen. So he is kind of with his friends, a group of 5 or 6 artists who had got together and declared that they were the Futurists. They were the people who were going to create the new future of Italian art. And they started their campaign in Venice. And that campaign culminated in a fight that would happen about an hour after this photo was taken. You can already tell that they're a strange looking group when you start considering the clothing that they're wearing. So when everyone's dressed up in their kind of their attire for going to La Fenice, their attire to the theatre, it's quite typical that you would see people with waistcoats. And as we know that waistcoats have all of these kind of useless little pockets on them. So the clothing that they're wearing is kind of all trying to subvert the sort of clothing that people would wear to somewhere like La Fenice or La Scala. So we've got all these little hands on Marinetti's waistcoat that have been stitched in over the top, as if kind of all of these little pockets should have been designed to have all of these little hands going into them. Anyway, during the intermission, Marinetti got up and while everyone was going off and kind of grabbing their Prosecco, he cried out. He kind of started this long speech. He stood up on a chair. He had his other kind of fellow artists and henchmen surrounding him so people couldn't push him off his chair. And he cried out, "Venetians, When we cried, let's murder the moonlight, we were thinking of you, old Venice grimy with romanticism. But now our voice has grown louder and we add with a roar, let's free the world from the tyranny of love. We are sick of erotic adventures, lechery, sentimentalism, and nostalgia. Why persist, Venice, in offering us veiled women at every twilight turn of your canals? Enough, enough. Stop whispering your obscene invitations to all the passers-by of the earth, O Venice, you procuress, you who under your heavy mantilla of mosaics persist in preparing enfeebling romantic nights, querulous serenades, and frightful ambushes. So it's straight away, I think, kind of we're getting a sense of what Marinetti's tone is like, that it's the sort of rhetoric he is using is a highly charged, highly emotive rhetoric, but implicit within this as well is an idea of Venice as the very antithesis of the modern world. Whereas this new modern world they were hoping for would be kind of an ultra-masculinist world, this new world that they're trying to create is being held back by the sort of sentimentalism, erotic adventures that are promised by Venice. So they've got this very, very deep, very strong dislike of Venice that runs right through this campaign in 1910. And indeed, this kind of dislike of women more generally runs throughout Marinetti's work and many of the Futurists' work. Deeply, their rhetoric at least, is deeply misogynistic. And that's kind of one of the first problem we start seeing with the Futurists. It's in their opposition of the past as being feminine and the future being male, they're automatically excluding certain people from being part of this new movement. But the reason why they've picked Venice, so while they're thinking that this new world will be modernized, this new world will be industrialized, the reason why they're picking Venice is that about 8 years before their campaign, the Campanile of San Marco had fallen down. So we were able to get photos of the actual moment of its collapse, which I'm showing you here on the left, because large cracks and fissures started appearing in 1902, running up the length of the tower. So a camera was set up, and that camera was constantly kind of tended to be able to photograph the moment when the tower finally collapses. But the collapse of this tower gives birth to the com era dov'era movement, as it was, where it was. This idea that Italy shouldn't try and modernize too much, that everything should be maintained in its ancient form. All those things that we love about Italy, it's kind of its medieval towns, its Renaissance cityscapes. This movement was trying to preserve that. So rather than building a new modern bell tower, they built an exact replica of that bell tower to make it as it was, where it was. With the only difference being that when they made the new one in the early 20th century, they put up a nice elevator shaft in the middle of it so you didn't have to climb the stairs all the way to the top. But there's this attempt to try and preserve the past at the expense of the future. That's something that really kind of gets the Futurists going. There's something about it that kind of deeply annoys them, and kind of it challenges their idea of what they should be trying to do. So just prior to that fight, and the start of their campaign, Marinetti and his friends had got together and printed off hundreds and thousands of these pamphlets, which were kind of a long rant, I suppose, against passeism and against passeism in Venice. In the 1910, they went up to the top of the tower, and as people were streaming back through St. Mark's Square, coming back from a lovely day on the Lido, out on the beach enjoying themselves, this is the kind of the age that Thomas Mann wrote about in Death in Venice. You can imagine this is kind of the upper middle class of Europe, and Europe's aristocrats as well, returning from the beach to go and have a stroll around central Venice in the evening. And as they come vaporetto after vaporetto of people come back, they're up the top of the tower and they start showering down on people these pamphlets, which were kind of this long rant against Venice and passeism. So they said in this that we repudiate the old Venice, enfeebled and undone by centuries of worldly pleasure, though we too once loved and possessed it in a great nostalgic dream. We repudiate the Venice of foreigners, a market for counterfeiting antiquarians, a magnet of snobbery and universal imbecility, a bed whose bottom has been staved in by caravans of lovers, the bejeweled hip bath of cosmopolitan courtesans, the cloaca maxima of passeism. We want to cure and heal this putrefying city, this magnificent soul from the past. We want to reanimate and ennoble the Venetian people, fallen from their ancient grandeur, drugged by the morphine of nauseating cowardice and debased by the habit of shady business. We want to prepare the birth of an industrial and military Venice that can dominate the Adriatic Sea, that great Italian lake. So there's a theme that they're drawing on here of needing to reinvent Italy, to remodernize it so that Italy can recreate the Roman Empire. They're kind of a movement whose social aim is to make Italy great again. And that's coming through in this rant against passeggiatism. In total, they dropped 800,000 copies of this manifesto onto the piazza and onto the people who are coming back from their holiday on the beach. So it's kind of a fairly extreme move to make, but they go a step further as well. They kind of, when they start talking about what they want to do next, they start saying, let us hasten to fill in Venice's little reeking canals with the ruins from its leprous and crumbling palaces. Let us burn the gondolas, rocking chairs for cretins, and raise to the heavens the imposing geometry of metal bridges and factories plumed with smoke, to abolish the cascading curves of the old architecture. Let the reign of divine electric light finally come to liberate Venice from its venal moonlight for furnished rooms to let. So it's quite a while, and sometimes today when you see kind of scenes like this going through Venice, you do wonder kind of, well, maybe there are too many people crushed into it. But nonetheless, that's still what I think many of us find the beauty of Venice, is it is so different. But what the Futurists were trying to do was they wanted to turn it into a modern city, to make it great again, for Venice to adopt a new industrialized future. But while they're saying this, Venice had been quite systematically modernizing from about the 1840s onwards, from the period where Venice was part of Austria through to when Venice was brought into the newly unified Kingdom of Italy, and right through to the early 20th century. We see some evidence of this today. So if you're around the back of San Francesco della Vigna, you can still see the gasometers that were put in, which were part of an automated gas lighting system that was installed in Venice in the early 1900s. So automatic lighting gas lamps. We have steam-powered vaporettos operating in Venice. This is the first one up there. Regina Margherita, Queen Margherita, have been operating since the 1870s. Interestingly as well, they also in the 1880s had an electric-driven vaporetto, which in retrospect would have been a much better idea to develop the battery-powered ones rather than the ones that puff up kind of all sorts of stuff into the atmosphere. So Venice had been slowly modernizing, and that modernization had included connecting the city to the modern rail network, building new bridges, filling in canals to make it easier to get around Venice by foot. So you don't have to own a gondola to be able to get around the city. And much of how we experience the city of Venice, much of how we move around the city today comes from this modernization. But for the Futurists, that wasn't enough. That kind of Venice was still just being created as kind of an icon of Italy's past rather than a beacon for its future. The man behind this quite alarming rhetoric, this kind of very militaristic sort of rhetoric, is Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, who was known in his own lifetime as a young man as being the caffeine of Europe. It's kind of a wonderful kind of way of kind of capturing somebody's essence. Marinetti himself had been born in Alexandria in 1876. His father was a lawyer who was working for the then Sultan in Egypt to modernize Egypt's industry, to do things kind of to oversee the creation of railroads, to help liberalize the economy in Egypt. And Marinetti grows up in Egypt as part of this group who's thinking kind of, well, we can take this ancient country and turn it into a very modern place. We can improve the standard of living. We can create more employment. While he's there, he's educated initially in Egypt, and while he's in high school in 1894, he founds his first literary journal called Papyrus. He then goes to Paris, initially to as a kind of a finishing school, and then goes to study law at Padua and then at Genoa. In 1902, he publishes his first anthology of poetry. He publishes that anthology in French. Marinetti is equally fluent, is equally capable of writing poetry in French or Italian. He's completely bilingual. But then shortly after that, he decides to make Milan his home. But he starts traveling to Paris, traveling to parts of southern Germany, traveling across Italy very, very frequently. Indeed, he starts transforming a train carriage. So rather than just having a single seat, he'll buy a ticket which comes with a couple of compartments in a carriage of a train, and he turns those into kind of a mobile office. He's the caffeine of Europe because he's always moving around, always talking to people, always changing location, not sleeping for days on end, hastily, rather than write letters to people, he would write very, very long telegrams, which were ultimately very, because he loved the speed of it, the instantaneousness, that kind of the telegram, once composed, goes from this city to that city in an instant. And he loves this speed and kind of the energy and dynamism that comes with new technologies. In 1905, he founds his first adult literary magazine, Poesie. And when he founds this, he's thinking this is a journal for new literature, a new literature that will capture the experiences of a new world, this new world we're living in. And he writes to the kind of many famous writers across Europe, asking them for contributions to his magazine. He writes to Apollinaire, who says, oh yeah, okay, maybe I'm a bit busy at the moment, I won't get round to it. He writes to the famous Italian poet Gabriele D'Annunzio. D'Annunzio writes back saying, it's a very interesting idea, but I'm very busy at the moment. Maybe in a couple of years I'll have time to contribute to it. He also writes to André Gide, and he asks Gide to compose a piece on the beauty of Italian women. Now, this is surely tongue-in-cheek, because by this stage, Gide had mostly proved himself adept at describing the beauty of young Algerian men rather than Italian women. So unsurprisingly, there's not a huge response to this new journal, but nonetheless, he does get it up and off the ground. I'm trying to kind of connect into the avant-garde of Europe's literary scene to get people on sides for this idea of using literature and art to create a new future, to transform society. If we jump forward a few years later, we have them creating the first Futurist Manifesto. By this stage, he's got a number of young Italian artists on side who are excited by these ideas of him, including Luigi Russolo over here, Umberto Botchoni over here, and Gino Severini over here. These people would become kind of the core of the Futurist movement. But in the Futurist Manifesto, which they initially published on the front page of Le Figaro, they wrote that my friends and I stayed up all night, sitting beneath the lamps of a mosque whose star-studded filigreed brass domes resembled our souls, all aglow with the concentrated brilliance of an electric heart. For many hours, we'd been trailing our age-old indolence back and forth over richly adorned oriental carpets, debating at the uttermost boundaries of logic and filling up masses of paper with our frenetic writings. So they continue in this sort of way, talking about themselves and talking about them being almost lost, kind of they're contemplating what the world is, they're trying to write their way out of the hole that they feel that they're surrounded on, what they feel that they're surrounded by. And then they suddenly they're awoken by the sound of electric tram cars rattling down the road, the sounds of industry in the distance. And they come up with what's effectively a 12-point plan, 12 principles on which to found a new art. Now, I won't go through all of these principles, but I'll just read you a couple of these kind of aphorisms for what a new art should be based on. We wish to sing the praises of the man behind the steering wheel, whose sleek shaft traverses the earth, which itself is hurtling at breakneck speed along the racetrack of its orbit. We believe that this wonderful world has been further enriched by a new beauty, the beauty of speed. A racing car, its bonnet decked with exhaust pipes like serpents with galvanic breath. A roaring motoring car, which seems to race on like machine gun fire, is more beautiful than the winged victory of Samothrace. We wish to glorify war, the sole cleanser of the world, militarism, patriotism, the destructive art of the libertarian, beautiful ideas worth dying for, and scorn for women. That last one is perhaps the kind of something that I think shows potential problems with where this movement will go. However, I think that some of the art that these futurists produce starts to become separated from this sort of rhetoric, this Marinetti-driven rhetoric. And we find that Marinetti, by the 1920s, has almost been deserted by the other futurists as somebody who's just a little bit too much of an extremist. They also write, though, that we wish to destroy museums, libraries, academies of any sort, and fight against moralism, feminism, and every kind of materialistic, self-serving cowardice. So they really do seem to believe that their art is going to change the world. When Le Figaro published this, though, they got a number of letters of complaint about this, and Le Figaro backed away from it, saying kind of, well, we thought it was historically significant. As it turned out, this was the very first of the artist manifestos, something that then every art group in the world has to produce a manifesto. The Futurists were the first to do so. But this work here, Le Figaro said, well, kind of, they're entitled to their opinions. We don't say that we agreed with them, even though we put it on the front page of the newspaper. But that last part about destroying the museums, because it's about a view of Italy as becoming encrusted with the ages. And the idea of Italy's museums being like cemeteries is actually quite realistic. So up above on the top right here is a photo of the main cemetery of Milan. And down below is one of the corridors of the Vatican museums. And this a way of arranging space between the museum and the cemetery is very, very similar. It's lines and lines of dead things, commemorating the past rather than looking towards the future. So they say that it is in Italy that we are issuing this manifesto, even though it was published in Le Figaro in Paris, of ruinous and incendiary violence, by which we today are founding Futurism, because we want to deliver Italy from its gangrene of professors, archaeologists, tourist guides, and antiquarians. Italy has been too long the great seller of secondhand clothing. We want to get rid of the innumerable museums which cover it with innumerable cemeteries. They don't want art locked away like this. They want art to be a part of life. And ultimately, they want art to be involved in the transformation of the world. They seem to sincerely believe that art can change society. So the Venetian Campaign is coming on the back of the publication in Le Figaro. It's coming back on the back of this concerted attempt to try and promote this new type of art. So it's full of speeches, pamphleteering, and ultimately at La Fenice, a scuffle. As Marinetti is delivering his speech, people are trying to shout him down, are trying to shut him up. But he has kind of a friend of his, one of his close friends, happened to be a butcher, and the guy was just huge, kind of big, meaty hands. And it was just like kind of his role there was basically to pick up chairs and thump people if they tried to get too close to stop Marinetti from speaking. Ultimately, they're overpowered, and Marinetti is knocked off his chair by somebody who throws a chair at him, and they're expelled from La Fenice. Marinetti, shortly after this Venetian campaign, leaves Venice, and he spends most of the next few years working as a war correspondent in North Africa and Eastern Europe. He's fascinated by war and goes off to report from the front lines as Italy is beginning to be engaged in various wars. But by this stage, there's not much futurism apparent in visual arts in this time. We're beginning to see the emergence of some futurist poetry, but these guys are heralding an idea, but they haven't started really to come up with the goods. One of the first key futurist works, however, is not a work of visual art, but a work of poetry. And it's Marinetti's Zang Tum Tum, which he wrote about the Battle of Adrianople in 1912. And just to give you a little bit of this, I'll just play you a short part of, oops, where have I gone? A short part of Marinetti's poem, because it gives, I think, a sense of the language, the sound, the way, what he's doing differently in poetry.
L'orchestra, stagni di guazzare, buoi, bufali, pungoli, carri, flic-flac, zing-zing, shock, illeri, nitriti, tre battaglioni bulgari in marcia, rock, Shumi Marizza, o Carvaveda, gran, 200 tanti in arrivo, 149 in partenza, croc, Grida gli ufficiali sbattacchiare come piatti d'ottone, pandi qua, pandi là, cim, bum, 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 ciao! Che bello, vampe, 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 ribalta di forti, vampe, 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 ribalta di forti, vampe, vampe, vampe. Laggiù, dietro quel fiume, Shukri Pasha comunica telefonicamente con 27 forti in turco e tedesco. Allo Ibrahim Rudolf, allo, attori, ruoli, echi, suggeritori, scenari di fumo.
Okay. So it's just a small part of this poem, Zang Tum Tum, just to give you a sense of how he's using language in a different way. That part of what he sees about the revival of language is that language should become a vehicle for expressing essential parts of the modern world, that language shouldn't be romanticized. And he's using quite a lot of onomatopoeia to try and capture the energy of the battlefield, from the zang tum tum of mortars going off for artillery to the ratatatating, the sounds of singing as soldiers charge across the battlefield. So this is kind of a grand celebration of war in 1912, and celebrating war in a way that no one would really seriously consider doing only a few years after he wrote this. When we start looking at what's happening amongst this initial group of futurists, we could start looking at, say, what before and after an artist comes into contact with Marinetti. So before Umberto Botchoni met Marinetti, he had been working on a scholarship effectively in Venice. And this is one of these works from this period of, say, 3 or 4 years where he's working on scholarship in Venice, developing his own art. And we can see here, I think, that he's adopting a post-impressionist style. He is really concerned with the beauty of Venice, the play of light in Venice, the range of color, the way the color bounces and refracts off the water, off the sky, off the glass. And he's capturing that using what is, in 1907, a fairly straightforward post-impressionist method. If we skip forward to what he's painting after meeting and befriending Marinetti, we start seeing that his style shifts very, very radically. This one here, States of Mind, The Farewell from 1911, was part of a large triptych. And what he's trying to do is he's showing kind of the different stages of movement. In this case here, the Farewell is people boarding a train and that train departing, moving from one city to another. It's interesting, I think, because he's using a very, very similar palette as he was in his earlier work, but his aesthetic has changed rapidly. Whereas in this work here, he's trying to capture a single moment and to immortalize that moment in art. In here, he's capturing many pieces of time, many different parts of a continuum of time, and incorporating those in amongst one another. So we see, for example, the train moving in one direction. We see the train moving from the front here with the steam pouring out. We've got people coming and going. We've got the whole scene, which might take, say, 15, 20 minutes of farewells and the departure of a train, captured within a single moment. So it's, rather than freeze framing a moment of time, it's about compressing time into a single canvas, which I think is what he's trying to show here. Similarly, we find somebody like Luigi Russolo in this, his work Solidity of Fog is trying to do similar things. But here, Russolo is compressing space as well. So these figures, these gentleman-like figures, look a lot like people walking through the fog in the city like Milan, which when the fog comes down in the Po Valley, it comes down and it's difficult to see. You've got the rays of light that are moving, kind of creating these kind of waves of energy that move through time, that kind of providing a structure to that time. But then you have these other figures, and you've got these marks here, which look a lot like rifles with bayonets attached. And in the distance, a fire. And it's thought that this is possibly kind of a scene from a front line at night in North Africa. So he's combining kind of people walking around in Milan with the scene at night in Africa, this experience of fog, and the way that the fog creates solidity in the atmosphere, that the atmosphere is not a void that we walk through, that the atmosphere as we walk through it is itself solid. And what he's interested in is capturing the motion of bodies and the movement of light through a solid atmosphere rather than a clear atmosphere. We find that other artists are also kind of concerned with these planetary motions, that idea that the world is spinning, it's hurtling around its orbit at thousands and thousands of kilometers each hour. And that as we move across the Earth, we're just another another movement on a body that's moving, surrounding another body that's moving, that the entire universe is not static. The universe is governed by motion rather than stasis, even though we appear to feel that the world doesn't move and everything moves around us, that we're actually part of planetary motions, and our movements across the earth add to that. In this case here, Giacomo Balla had been observing the passing of Mercury across the sun through a telescope, obviously one that had been filtered so he didn't go blind by looking at a planet moving in front of the sun. But he tries to capture that movement and kind of the effects of the light, the different shadows, the different angles. And so kind of this idea of getting a planetary motion, this vision he had of kind of the whole solar system coming together in this series of orbits and shafts of light and shadow cast by, in this case here, you've got a green shadow here that's being cast by this tiny planet Mercury, and you've got this green line continuing. So the shadow of the planet is a continuum of that green line of the planet's movement as it traverses the sun. Other futurists, such as Carlo Carrà, are interested in not so much planetary motion, but interested in the urban environment that we live in, and this confusion of signage. As newspapers, as billboards become more and more common, we're surrounded by language. So in this case here, he's trying to show an urban environment that is just pure signage alone. And he's doing this one from 1914. He'd started doing this in 1913. He calls this one an interventionist demonstration, patriotic holiday / free word painting. So it's kind of this very elusive, is this meant to be some form of demonstration? Is this people waving flags in the city on a public holiday? Are these the placards that people are holding up during a protest? Or is this just a free word painting? The idea of, as we see happening in futurist poetry, they're interested in concrete poetry. And so the visual appearance of words on a page is important to them, just as for Carrà, the use of language on a canvas is important too. So there are some kind of pretty clear parallels in what they're doing with what had been happening in France, in Paris in particular, also in this same period. We know that the futurists, people like Severini, people like Carlo Carrà and others, are deeply interested in analytical cubism, which had only started to really emerge in Paris around 1910 and 1911. And they love the work of Georges Braque and Marcel Duchamp. And they're kind of influenced by these ideas, that they're showing that it's more realistic to show an object from multiple points simultaneously. That we're going to get rid of frontal vision. You don't just, an object doesn't exist seen from only one side. You've got that multiplicity of views on a single object. And in the case of Sad Young Man on a Train, Duchamp is capturing the different motions of that person as the train moves through space as well. So they're fascinated by what's happening, and they start integrating some of these ideas too. With Botchoni, we see this coming through in a slightly different way. And ultimately, I think Botchoni, of the early futurists, is the most significant and the most interesting as a painter. In this case here, his dynamism of a cyclist is this idea that the bicycle is a perfect fusion of a man and a machine. You get all of that energy and will of a human being combined with a simple machine that allows that person to suddenly move at great speed. Keep in mind that in 1913, a guy on a bike can move faster than move faster than a car can. So there really is, I think, a strong reason to connect the bicycle and its simplicity and the way a body and a machine join together in seeing that as kind of this symbol of the future. This is also the period of kind of where we start seeing the birth of cycle racing in Europe, particularly in Italy and France, and this kind of national love of the bicycle and what you can do on it. But what we're seeing here isn't just an ordinary picture of a person on a bicycle. He's trying to show that person's movement through space. So you can see things like this, like the white part down here. It does look like a spinning wheel. You get a sense of a head and a body, arms and legs that are kind of crouched over the handlebars, pedaling away furiously. But rather than showing a single arm, what he's trying to do is to show the arcs that the limbs make, the arcs that body cuts through space. So as the legs are kind of back and forth, pounding and pounding, he's capturing the kind of that motion that the leg, let's say the knee or the ankle make, and he's trying to capture those arcs of the motion rather than the static parts of a body. It's a theme that Botchoni would return to in his work, as I'll show you in a moment. But in many ways, I think Botchoni is the ultimate futurist painter, whereas Marinetti is the great theorist, the great poet, and a bit of a madman. Botchoni is, I think, much more genuinely concerned with creating fantastic art. So in general, kind of futurism as an art movement is focusing on dynamism over stasis, trying to capture motion and energy, interactions between objects and spaces. They're interested in electrification, bright electric lighting, radical use of color, paintings that still seem to kind of shine off the wall towards you. Marinetti even debated calling it, rather than futurism, calling the movement electricism instead. They're obsessed with speed. They're really fascinated by the fourth dimension and the relativity of time and space, the idea that time and space, three dimensions, are unable to describe the universe around us adequately. And they're starting to think in quite interesting ways of a fourth dimension. They don't seem to have any contact or any familiarity with Einstein, but they're working with quite similar ideas, that time and space are defined by motion, they're defined by energy, they're defined by a fourth dimension rather than being separate dimensions. But they think that part of, if you start focusing on these things, these modern knowledges, these modern experiences, that you can use art as a way of being able to transform society, that the artist is part of an avant-garde. And what they'll do is, by creating new visions of the future, they'll be able to take the vision that they've pulled down from the heavens through their mind, and they'll use their artwork as a bridge to help other people get from the past where they are to that future that the artist has seen. So they're styling themselves as heralds of a future in that sense, that we'll create the bridge through our art for you to cross, to join us in this magnificent new future. They're obsessed with automation and with the fusion of man with machine. This is ultimately based on a belief that modern people have a different world experience. And in their case, I'll put it as modern man, because they write almost explicitly, exclusively, this is a world for men, that women are meant to be kind of playing a supportive role at home. We've got some questions coming through, which I'll leave some time to answer those at the end. Yes. So they're working in this idea that kind of this new experience, this new world has to be created through them. We see again happening in Botchoni's work as he's trying to capture these ideas. But interestingly, for somebody who's obsessed with dynamism, obsessed with motion, obsessed with speed, he becomes increasingly interested in sculpture, something which is traditionally is ultimately static, can't be anything other than static. Once it's made, it stays in one spot. His most famous sculpture, this one here, is the unique forms of dynamism in space. And he wrote about it, that while the Impressionists paint a picture to give one particular moment and subordinate the life of the picture to its resemblance to this moment, we synthesize every moment, every time, place, form, color, tone, and thus paint the picture. And the idea here, I think, is that kind of the artwork is unique unto itself. The artwork is not representing a moment that the eye saw, that the artwork represents is itself an entire world contained. And for this work too, it seems clear to me that this succession is to be found in a repetition of legs, arms, and faces, as many people have stupidly believed, but is achieved through the intuitive search for the unique form which gives continuity in space. That it's not a particular head, it's not about an arm or a leg, it's not about putting, to show a crowd, putting 7 or 8 arms and legs together. It's about creating this form that shows something moving through space. So again, here, this arch here, these arcs around the shoulder aren't an arc of a shoulder standing still. This is the motion the body makes, a motion that shoulder makes that he's trying to capture as it moves through space. So you see here in the back of the leg, this leg is both half lifted up in the air and being put down. This leg here is striding forward and about to lift simultaneously. So it's about capturing a whole period of time, a motion, and finding a form that can contain time and space as a continuum in a single object. So it's rather, what he's trying to do there, I think, is rather quite complicated. We do have some futurists, though, who have a bit more of a sense of humor, who take themselves a little bit less seriously. And this is, I think, one of the most wonderful works to come out of this early stage of futurism. And it's Giacomo Ballas' Dynamism of a Dog on a Leash. So you can imagine that Ballas had been talking to people like Botchoni, talking to his friend as he's espousing all this quite complex philosophical stuff about dynamism and philosophy and the unique form of continuity in space. And Botchoni's response is the dynamism of a dog on the leash. As the dog goes running down the road, you've got its legs spinning around. It's obviously a very happy dog. Look at the way its tail's going everywhere, almost propelling it forward across the ground, the leash shaking back and forth. So I think that while a lot of the futurists take themselves very seriously, we do see, I think, in somebody like Ballas, a sense of humor, that kind of, that's a wonderful idea, guys, but you're making paintings. And this is just also very, very cute. So this belief in the power of art to transform society comes to this new idea of what technology can do, how we can change time, control our environment. But what they're ultimately looking for, I think, is not just making society more technologically sophisticated, not just modernizing industries, not creating a more convenient modern society. They're trying to reinvigorate people. And they think that this reinvigoration is at once personal and cultural. And underlying this, and part of those very nationalistic and militaristic ideas that the futurists are expressing, are coming from an irredentist philosophy that is running through Italian nationalism in the early 20th century. And it's this belief that anywhere that Italian is spoken, or anywhere which kind of has a strong Italian cultural connection, must be brought back in within the new modern Italian world. At the time, great territories of land up through here, around the border, down towards Istria, weren't part of Italy. They were still part of Austria up until the end of World War I. And there's a belief that all of these areas needed to be recaptured. Even though Italian is only a minority language in those regions, there's a sense that they need to be brought back in because they're historically Italian. Incidentally, Albania also counts, that because there are so many Albanians in Italy, by reverse logic, means that kind of Italy has a strong cultural claim to Albania. This, I think, explains a lot of what happens with Italian imperialism in the 1920s. Anything where Italy had been before should become part of Italy again. And when Italy was the center of the Roman Empire, that's quite a lot of territory to try and lay a claim to. So it's quite a popular belief in Italy that these areas should be part of Italy. When Italy joins up to World War I in 1915, the futurists put their money where their mouth is. And most of them joined the Bicycle Corps. So we have Marinetti up here as a new Bersaglieri, a member of the Bicycle Corps. And they were stationed just north of Verona in the Alps. So the Bicycle Corps were thought to be kind of this new great modern Italian corps because the bicycle can move across land faster than cars, faster than people. It would be a type of reconnaissance in force group. However, the Alps are not the best place to try and use a bicycle. If you've been there, you know it's very, very steep, and you're better off on foot than you are on a bicycle. And after 6 months, that Bicycle Corps was dissolved. We find that the futurists end up going to other places within the army. A few of the leading futurists were killed in World War I. So Botchoni dies in a horse accident. He was retraining to become a cavalry officer and on a training exercise fell off his horse and died 3 days later. Antonio Sant'Elia, who was a futurist architect, so just showing you one of his drawings of a new city. Sant'Elia never built anything, but he designed new buildings and new cities, and they're alarmingly modern. What he's tried to do with these designs for cities is finding a better way of integrating or creating an urban form that suits modern life, that provides greater convenience, that provides greater interaction between industry, residents, shopping. We start having this idea of multi-level transport underground, roads being crisscrossed by pedestrian bridges with railways underneath them, connecting these vast new towers and industrial centres. So Antonio Sant'Elia never got to build anything, but he did leave us these designs that look thoroughly like 21st century megacities. And he was drawing these before he died in 1916. Mario Sironi went on to write Propaganda, Marinetti, unsurprisingly, ends up driving a tank. Something that's kind of big, powerful, militaristic, makes a lot of noise like he did. But when he's not driving a tank around the place, he's writing letters from the front, writing novels to try and inspire the Italian nation to keep backing the war effort, even as things start going pear-shaped for them. After World War II, after World War I, Futurism's legacy starts to become quite complicated. So a number of the leading Futurists had died. Botchoni and Chantel, for example, were no longer there. The greatest Futurist painter, the Futurist architect, didn't make it through. However, Marinetti starts jumping on the bandwagon after World War I, saying, well, actually, Italy should have got a better deal. All of these territories of Austria, all of these other lands should have been made part of Italy following Italy's victory in World War I. So Marinetti starts the Futurist political party, and 6 months after the formation of the Futurist political party, Marinetti merges his political party with Mussolini's fascist party. And Marinetti remains a committed fascist right through until the late 1930s, when ultimately the a change of Mussolini's cultural policy, Mussolini's policy starts following Hitler's policy towards the arts in the middle of the 1930s, which leads to a broad rejection of modern art. And Marinetti kind of then is flung on the outside, he's rejected. But from that period, the early 20s through to the late 30s, Marinetti is a committed fascist. We find that not all Futurists are following Marinetti in this way, though, and a lot of Futurists either break and start pursuing different forms of art, trying to dissociate themselves with Marinetti, dissociate themselves with fascism. Others just go quiet. So Luigi Russolo, who was both a painter and a musician and a composer, retreats from public life almost entirely. He doesn't want to be associated with fascism, but it's clear in the 1920s, if you want to get ahead as an artist in Italy, you need to work with somebody who is allied to fascism in some form or another. So Russolo chooses just to withdraw from the public world, keep making music, keep making musical instruments, keep making art, but just to do that in private as a type of a passive disassociation because of his disagreement with where politics in Italy are going. So we find that while there are some Futurists who are committed fascists, you have a number of those early Futurists who just fall silent or try and break away from that movement. What I'm showing you here is another Futurist artist who was working with what we call a second phase, a new type of Futurism that starts having quite strong associations with fascism and becomes a type of a state-backed art form in Italy in the 1920s and early 30s. So on the left here is Renato Botelli's Profilo Continuo from 1933, where it's a portrait of Mussolini, but it's capturing kind of this idea of the immense energy of Mussolini, the ability to be everywhere at once, to be all-seeing. And as you walk around this one, which is held in the Museum of Modern Art in Rovereto, which is a fantastic modern art collection in Italy, as you walk around it, you notice that whichever angle you look at this, you always see Mussolini in profile. So this state-sponsored Futurism becomes a movement that is called aeropittura, aeroplane painting, which is either kind of images of things from the air. In this case here, it's an idea of it's another portrait of Mussolini with this kind of you've got the antiquity in the back of his mind, recreating the world of the Colosseum, but always looking forward to this new future. So it's this kind of highly nationalistic, and those nationalistic tendencies within the early Futurists seem to work very well with kind of what people like Mussolini and others want from their art. Another example is Giulio Danna, who's showing the dynamism of the train, the boat, and the plane. So you have the energy and motion of modernity, the way kind of these objects move with greater speed. They cut through time and space in ways that people had never really done before. Interestingly, you also get Futurist religious art. In this case, it's Bruno Tanner's Madonna dell'Alla from 1931. It looks a bit like a Madonna of the record player, the Madonna of the gramophone almost. Of these artists, though, who are working in this form, I think the most interesting visually is Benedetta Kappa, who was married to Marinetti, but she insists on her own independence, that she's doing her own art. And in this case here, this is a motorboat speeding across a lake, and you've got the lines echoing out of the wake of the motorboat. You've got the light bouncing off the wake in different directions. But you look and you see that this wake actually continues across in front of the motorboat, that the motorboat is realizing where it should be as it moves forward. So this constant sense of moving forward is just arriving in the place where you should be rather than moving to a new place. Her work is quite beautiful. This vision of a port, again, with this kind of, it begins to look very, very poster-like. And there are reasons, I think, for this, that part of what the fascists see in Futurism is an art form that converts very, very easily into poster art, into advertising, into ideas of a modern future. Kappa's largest work was a series on the synthesis of communications. In this case here, she's showing a radio communication. You've got the radio tower, you've got the globe, and you've got that radio tower communicating these waves circulating around the globe, this idea of a new future. So while we have all of these ideas of a new future being carried forth by these artists, we also find that they're moving towards types of advertising in their work too. And I'll just show you a couple of examples of what they're doing in this respect. This idea of mass communication and the simplicity of futurist forms, simple colors, and how that works in this respect. So one of the leading artists in this respect was Fortunato De Pero, who was employed by Davide Campari right throughout the late 20s and into the 30s to create even things like the Campari soda bottle you see today was the bottle that was designed by De Pero. It's still used, and Campari is still sold in those little so Campari soda is still sold in those little bottles. But also things such as this. On the left here, it's an ad he made for Campari. Se la pioggia fosse bitter Campari. If only the rain were bitter Campari. Fortunato De Pero becomes successful overseas. He ends up being sponsored by Campari to go and promote Italian culture, to promote Italian products, to promote Italian exports in New York. And that kind of becomes De Pero's way of disassociating himself with where Italy is going in the 1930s. He kind of ends up being able to spend more time in New York, both prior to and leading into World War II, and then after World War II as well, mostly working as an ad man. But of all the different attempts to try and use art to recreate a new society, I think perhaps the weirdest of them is what Marinetti wrote in the early 1930s when he publishes a cookbook. And he believes that kind of by changing what people eat, you can change the physical constitution of the nation. If you change the physical constitution of the nation, you can change their moral constitution as well. You can make people better by changing what they eat. And this is an idea I find fascinating because it preempts a lot of where we see food writing going in our own time more recently. There's almost this kind of a moral belief that what you eat will change the world. And Marinetti is kind of getting hold of that idea, albeit in a rather strange way. So these are some dishes that were prepared. In this case here, it's salmon that's been very finely sliced and interspersed with slices of orange. So it looks like salmon, but tastes like orange. It's a type of nouvelle cuisine. He recommended kind of foaming things up, transforming flavors. Some of these seem to work and look like modern dishes, whereas other ones, such as this dish down the bottom, is a salami that's been peeled and then cooked in coffee and would probably taste absolutely disgusting. So it's a very hit and miss cookbook. But behind this, and the kind of the chief idea of this cookbook, is the golden rule is that there can be no pasta, that pasta is the enemy. And he says, the futurist cooking of ours, tuned to high speeds like the motor of a hydroplane, will seem to some trembling traditionalists both mad and dangerous. But its ultimate aim is to create a harmony between man's palate and his life today and tomorrow. Futurist cooking will be free of the old obsessions with volume and weight, and will have as one of its principles the abolition of pasta asciutta. Pasta asciutta, however agreeable to the palate, is a passeist food because it makes people heavy, brutish, deludes them into thinking it is nutritious, makes them skeptical, slow, and pessimistic. pasta is completely hostile to the vivacious spirit and passionate, generous, intuitive soul of the Neapolitans. Any pasta shootist, well, I love this word, kind of a pasta shootist, a lover of pasta, who honestly examines his conscience at the moment he ingurgitates his biquotidian pyramid of pasta will find within the gloomy satisfaction of stopping up a black hole. This voracious hole is an incurable sadness of his. He may delude himself, but nothing can fill it. Only a futurist meal can lift up his spirits. So I'm not quite convinced that some of these futurist meals, particularly these ones down the bottom here, can actually lift up the soul, can really energize anyone. A salami cooked in coffee certainly wouldn't. But it's kind of one of the things I think is fascinating about futurism as an art movement is just how divisive and just how hit and miss it is, how it seems to have a huge effect on art. This kind of really develops an avant-garde art initially. And on the other hand, it has some of the most absurd and outrageous ideas attached to it. And in its attempt to try and overturn all traditions, to try and obliterate the past in Italy. Everything from kind of the art you see on the walls to sculpture to what you should eat from day to day. I shall stop here for today, but I've got some questions coming through in chat. So thank you very much for coming along and for spending some time inside listening to me when it is such a beautiful day if you're in Sydney to be outside. But I'll just bring up some questions here. Okay. So I have a question from Charles about whether arte povera was a reaction to futurism. I think that's a really, it's a fantastic question. In some ways, yes. So we find that the new art movements coming out of Italy after World War II by artists who are mostly rejecting the state-sponsored futurism of the 1920s and 30s. And even artists who lived through that, people like Sironi, find that they're tainted by fascism after World War II, and they effectively have to try and withdraw. These new movements, the first movements to come alive in Italy, are led by people like Lucio Fontana and Emilio Verva, both of whom had become part of Corrente, an art group formed in 1939 that was explicitly anti-fascist. So you have this immediately after World War II, this rejection of art that had been linked to the fascists, and a new group of artists led by people like Verva and Fontana, who are revolutionary in their own right. Arte povera, I think, with what Charles is suggesting, is perhaps an even further, an even larger rejection of it. But I think arte povera is mostly a rejection of the new consumerist culture that arises in Italy as part of Italy's economic miracle, the boom after World War II, as the country is rebuilt, as it has huge amounts of money poured into it from the Marshall Plan, and the creation of kind of American-style consumerism in Italy. And I think arte povera is mostly a rejection of consumer culture rather than of the connections between futurism and fascism. Thank you. I see some very kind and very lovely comments from you. Thank you very much. It's always great to know, especially in a medium like this where I can't see you. It's great to know that you've enjoyed it. So we have some. If there are other questions, I'm happy to. Okay, so we have another question coming through. Let's scroll up to find where it is. We've got a question from Douglas about music. So yes, there is and I could probably, as perhaps an outro shortly, can play you a little bit of futurist music. So the Luigi Russolo, in addition to being a painter, or he was a painter, but he was primarily a composer, and he wanted to create a new form of music that better represented the modern world, but he decided to do that. You needed to use different instruments. So he created these giant machines called intono remore, noise makers, noise intoners, to try and create, and each one, as you spin it around, emits a different sort of sound that comes out through a kind of a megaphone structure at the front. And you'd have these in different notes and different keys, and he would try and compose pieces for these new instruments. Contemporaries at the time wrote about the music and said that it sounded absolutely bloody awful. That kind of, we can't listen to this noise that he's trying to make. Isn't, after all, the point of music to try and escape kind of the absurd noises that the modern world makes around us? Yes. But we have this, I think, and I'll play a moment of that for you. But it is kind of, yeah, it is a very different sound, but more or less, I suppose the principle was to create a new sound for a modern world. You needed to create new instruments that you couldn't capture in the modern world in a violin, at least according to Russolo, both Luigi and his brother Antonio, who was another musician and composer. Before playing some of that, got a comment that Heston Blumenthal has created some dishes that would have suited the Futurists. Absolutely. The sorts of techniques that Marinetti describes are exactly that sort of cooking. Taking an object, it's the antithesis of Italian cooking. So when in Italian cooking, kind of, you know what's in the food because it looks the way, it still looks like what it was. But to try and turn things, to use oxygen, to use torches, to quite actually create foams of different substances that would look, and then you would shape them so that they would look like one thing but taste like something completely different. So there is a playfulness in it, and it does kind of, I think, preempt what people like Blumenthal have been doing. So I've got a comment as well about Italian fascism looking to the past, such as the glory of the empire, which seems quite the opposite of the philosophy of futurism. I think yes and no. I think the rejection of the past was strangely in Italy, and particularly in the 1920s, becomes linked to this idea of making Italy great. But it wasn't just to turn back the clock to become Romans. It was to recapture the energy that had allowed Italy to create the Roman Empire, and to be able to recapture that energy but improve on it using the power of modern technology. There's a separate movement, the Novecento movement, that appears in the 1920s, and that's a group of artists who are anti-futurist in that they don't want, they're looking to achieve the same end, this kind of making Italy great again. But what they want to do is to use Italian traditions as a foundation to create a new modern art that is an extension of Italian traditions into the future. So it's kind of, I think it's, yeah, for the Futurists, there's a shift, I think, between destroy everything is what they're saying before World War I, and then after World War I, we're finding Futurists who are saying, well, we can use art to recreate a glorious state that we've lost but should have always had. It's kind of it is a bit, there are contradictions running through Futurism. I think it's many of their ideas, especially Marinetti's, are not always very well thought through. But if there aren't other questions or comments, I'll play you a little part of Luigi Russolo's music. So there was a recent, few years ago, a couple of groups based in LA worked with kind of recreating his instruments and figuring out how to perform these compositions. So I will just find some of those. I can't see what's happened to my screen here. Oh, there we go, it's just the next window across. So to give you a sense of what this tastes like, or what it sounds like. So each of these boxes is playing a unique sound, and the idea of the composition is to find the right way of combining these kind of things that sound like urban noises and combining those with single notes from human voices in this case. Oh, wow. So we have a member of the audience who supervised Luciano, who is being featured in this. So, wow, that's that's amazing. So I hope I assume his thesis went very well at UC Davis. Well, thank you all again for coming along, and I look forward to talking to you again sometime. If you have any further follow-up questions, then, or you wanted to have some links or anything, then please get in contact with me at nick@theshortcourse.org. I'll just put this in here for you in case you would like it. But yes, any link or any follow-up questions you might have or thoughts, please feel free to get in touch.